Welcome to another special edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint, and we have been working our way through Jonah chapter 1, if you've been following along, depicted nicely here in this mosaic. And we reached the end of the chapter, or at least close to that, where Jonah's been thrown into the water, and we all know how the story goes. A fish comes and swallows him up, or three fish, I suppose, as in this mosaic. But a very interesting and peculiar question arises. Where does chapter 1 end and chapter 2 begin? Now, you might not think that's a very interesting question. If you just open up in your English Bible, you'll see that there's clearly a start of a chapter 2, but it's actually not quite that simple. We're going to work our way through some English Bibles, then take a look at some critical editions and some manuscripts and see what's actually happening, because it's pretty weird. Let's dig in. We're going to start with the CSB, just picking one out randomly off my shelf. Zooming in here, you'll see that chapter 1 ends with Jonah being with the Lord appointing a fish to swallow Jonah, and then Jonah being in the belly of that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Notice it's numbered 1, verse 17 here. It has two parts, the appointing of a great fish or sending of a great fish, and Jonah being in there for 3 days and 3 nights. Hold that thought, we'll come back to it. Chapter 2 starts off with Jonah praying from amid that fish. That may seem fairly straightforward. Obviously, this is chapter 2. But hold on. If you go to the Lexham English Septuagint, which is what you see here, it's a little bit different. We see verse 16, the men pray vows and all that kind of stuff. And then we have the start of chapter 2. That's when the Lord sends this sea monster or this fish to swallow Jonah, and he's in there for 3 days and 3 nights. So that's chapter 2, verse 1. Then chapter 2, verse 2 is Jonah praying. It's off by 1 compared to the Christian Standard Bible, and no mention is made of this issue in the Lexham Septuagint. Well, then let's go to the ESV here. Here's what we notice. Similar to the CSB, they have the end of chapter 1, that is verse 17 in their numbering. The Lord sends this fish. Jonah's in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So far, so good. And then they start chapter 2 with Jonah's prayer. So again, it's the same as the CSB, but it's one off relative to the Lexham English Septuagint. But in contrast to the CSB, or at least the CSB that I have, it may be possible that others note this, but not the ones that I have on my shelf, notice there's a little footnote here. So let's take a look at that footnote. Down very small in the margin, they say chapter 2:1 in the Hebrew. So they're saying that what they are giving you as 1:17 equals 2:1 in the Hebrew. Of course, ironically, it's actually 2:1 in the Septuagint as well. They don't mention that. So what's going on here? Well, let's kind of peel back the layers and take a look to help us keep track of this, because obviously we can't track things using verse numbers because they differ. I'm going to just assign some alphabetic labels. So everybody has as 1:16, the men being afraid, they make a sacrifice to the Lord, they vow some vows, etc. So we'll just call that A. That's not that big of a deal. Everybody's good with that, so that one's fine. The next sentence, which is actually 2 clauses, you have God sending that fish or appointing the fish, and then you have Jonah in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. We're going to call that B1 and B2. We call it B because it is technically one whole verse, but it's broken up into these 2 clauses. That'll matter as we get further along. And then C is going to be Jonah's prayer. And we'll sort of summarize all this as we go, but let's kind of track these things through. Let's begin with Rolf's Honhart Septuaginta. I've had some videos on this previously. It's a pretty common critical edition that most of you will probably be familiar with. So let's zoom in and see what they do. Notice we have the men fearing a great fear, vowing vow. So that's A, no big deal. And then as 2:1, notice, by the way, that was 1:16 over here. In 2:1, they have the Lord sent this great fish and all that. And then 2:2 is Jonah prayed. So that's consistent with what we saw, for instance, in the Lexham English Septuagint. Well, it's interesting. So in other words, there's a chapter break before B1. So this is B1 right here, the sending of the fish. If you look at the apparatus, what's interesting is that here, this is where you would see, 1:17, or here where you see the 2:1. They make no reference to any issues here. So there's no footnote about it, unlike what we saw, for instance, in the ESV. What if you look at the Göttingen edition? I've also introduced this previously. Exact same treatment. So you have 2:1 here is the Lord sent this fish or this great sea monster. 2:2 is Jonah prayed. We have A up here ending in 1:16. So that's consistent with Rolf's. So in other words, there's a chapter break before B1. That is the Lord sending the fish. If you look at its apparatus, same deal. You have no mention of any of this stuff here at 2:1 or any mention of it in 1:16 up above, which is right here. You got a bunch of stuff going on, but none of it is about the versification. Well, what about the Hebrew? So I've put BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, on the screen here. This is what the ESV is referring to when it says 2:1 in the Hebrew. And so this is 2 verse 1, and it is the Lord sent this great fish, etc., etc. So BHS puts the chapter break before B1, just like the ESV did, just like the CSB did, and in fact, just like the Greek tradition does as well. Hold that thought. Now, you may be wondering, well, let's take a look at some manuscripts. Let's get rid of these critical editions. Let's take a look at some of the manuscripts. So we'll work our way through some of the key examples here. Let's start with the Leningrad Codex, which is the main basis of the BHS. I actually just got a nice, lovely facsimile copy. Very hard to find these days. Shipped over to me from England, so that's pretty sweet. So this is from that, and obviously this numbering is added much, much later, and they're saying it is 2 verse 1, and indeed that is where the BHS starts, chapter 2 verse 1, with the Lord sending the fish and so forth. But what you notice is there's no markings anywhere. There's no indication in the margins that you will often have that this is the start of a new unit. It's all just flat. I mean, sure, there's a new verb that starts here, but that's not that uncommon. You have that here as well, and here, and all that. So it's really ambiguous, in other words, as to how is this scribe, how are the Masoretes sort of segmenting this, because there's just not a lot to go on. Even zooming in closer, you just don't see all that much. So I would argue there's no clear segmentation, and perhaps in the English versification that sort of took place partly with Stephanus and some others prior to him in the sort of early Middle Ages, and then also sort of post-printing press where the versification kind of solidified, that's probably where this is from. Clearly in English hand or Arabic numerals there. But there's no real indication that that's what the Masoretes were doing or not doing. It's just ambiguous. Let's take a look at some Greek manuscripts. Let's begin with Codex Sinaiticus. Zooming in here. And this is really quite interesting. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on, or I have spent some time on sort of reading this in Sinaiticus. So you got a bunch of textual variants and all these kinds of interesting stuff. But here is the end of A, if you will. This is the praying the prayers and vowing the vows and all that kind of stuff. And so you can see there's the yuchas. You can see there's a medial dot, so that's a very low-level segmentation. And then we have, and the Lord sent this great fish. So there is a very minor, not even a real paragraph break, because there's no ekthesis, there's no no paragraphos, essentially just a sentence break, if you will, before A. And then it goes all the way down where Jonah is in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So all of B, both 1 and 2, is just really a continuation of the prior paragraph with just one very small division. There's a higher dot at the end of that, and then you have ekthesis. This is just a blob in the manuscript, but you do very clearly see an ekthesis here, and then you have Jonah praying. So that's where the scribe of Sinaiticus places the division. In other words, there is a chapter break here before C, actually, and B is included in the sort of prior section. So that's pretty weird. That's not at all what the Lexham English Septuagint or Rolf's or the Gooding edition reflect anywhere. Let's take a look at Alexandrinus. Here we have them praying their prayers, vowing their vows. You got the Eucharist there, and then you do have an ekthesis, big letter. That's very common with Alexandrinus, and then the Lord sending this fish all the way down through the 3 days and 3 nights. So this is B1 and B2 here. It's all treated as one paragraph. That's fine. No big deal there. And you might look over the margin and say, oh, okay, they number it chapter 2. Great. But that's very clearly later. Of course, that's not from the original hand of Sinaiticus. That's very obvious. Probably added by some librarian later, and it matches what eventually becomes the standard versification. What's more interesting to me is this little marking. That is actually very common in Codex Alexandrinus as a discourse marker of some sort, and it appears to be above this next line, which is, and Jonah prayed. In other words, that's what I've been calling C. I would suggest, now I haven't looked into this in detail, that the scribe is actually starting, or at least attempting to signal that this is the bigger delimiter here. Now, you might see, well, there's a whole big gap here. Well, it appears to be some sort of erasure or something that's a little bit of a bleed through or a remainder. I don't think that's a major discourse kind of thing, but it's hard to really make sense of what's going on with what's happened here. Either way, I would suggest this is marking the start of C, perhaps, as the new chapter, or at least as equivalent to the start of B1. In other words, there's a chapter break before B1, sort of, kinda, at least according to some later librarian, or maybe it's actually before C, if you want to go by this marking right here. So Alexandrinus really muddies the waters. What about Vaticanus? Zooming in on this, we have yet even more chaos. And so here you have the vowing of the vow, so that's going to be A. Then you have the sort of end line here, ekthesis in the margin, so starting at least a new paragraph, and this is the Lord sending the fish, that's B1. But notice, high dot, and you haven't finished. B2, that is Jonah being in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, actually starts here. And Jonah was in the fish, blah, blah, blah. That also has ekthesis, and it has this big paragraph number. Now, this may have been added and expanded whenever Vaticanus was re-inked. You can tell it's quite dark, it's quite a big letter, but you can faintly see that there was something originally there. And my colleague, Chuck Hill, has studied these numbers and so forth and concluded that largely throughout Vaticanus, those paragraph markers and numberings in the margin, it's a beta in the margin, and you can sort of make it out, most likely go back to the original scribe of Vaticanus, and then maybe it was enlarged. It's made a big beefy B there at some later date. Then you have yet another paragraph divider for the prayer of Jonah, so it's C down here. In other words, this is actually B2 in my nomenclature, whereas B1 was up here. So cleaning this up a bit, this is what Vaticanus gives us. There's a new paragraph before B1 right here, a chapter division, a much bigger division before B2, so he split the clause, and then there's a new paragraph before C. So that is enormously complicated. So let's try to summarize all this chaos. Here, I've just shown on screen a table that goes through the evidence, not in the exact order that we just did it, just kind of summarizing in a way. So Vaticanus, again, has the paragraph breaks at B1 and C, but a new chapter at B2, splitting that clause. Sinaiticus has a chapter break before C, and then Alexandrinus has a chapter break before B1 or C. It kind of depends, but what's interesting is that you just have very different treatments of it, and none of those 3 treatments of it agree with the Greek editions. The Greek editions put a chapter break before B1. There's not a chapter break for any of them that's sort of clear before B1, except for maybe the one in Alexandrinus, but that's clearly later. I would suggest that the Greek tradition appears to have been most likely something either before C or before B2, but they don't agree. And so I'm just surprised, actually, that the critical editions make no reference to this whatsoever. And that's a part of a broader issue in our critical editions, that they by and large rarely mention sort of paratextual features like that, like paragraph segmentation. The Editio Critica Major of Revelation on the New Testament side has started to do that, which is very helpful, although very convoluted. But in general, our critical editions don't do a great job reflecting that kind of scribal stuff. Codex Leningrad, it has really nothing, but the BHS probably drawing on what becomes the English tradition in the High Middle Ages, puts the paragraph, the chapter break before B1, even though there's really nothing in the manuscript that it's drawing on that would suggest that. And then when you get to just a few English Bibles, the Lexham English Septuagint does B1, which reflects none of these, right? It does reflect the critical edition, so I understand it. I'm just surprised they didn't footnote anything. CSB puts it before C, which is kind of odd, because it's not super clear where they're getting that from. I mean, maybe they're getting it from Sinaiticus, who knows? And then the SV follows suit with the CSB in most English Bibles, but at least mentions the Hebrew kind of B1 option in the footnote, which, by the way, is kind of the Greek option, except for that it's not the Greek option, because none of the manuscripts support what the Greek editions do. So I have no idea what to make of this. Where does Jonah 1 end and Jonah 2 begin? Nobody knows, apparently. I wish I had a better, clear answer. It doesn't matter ultimately, not really, but it's kind of interesting to start the chapter 2 one place versus the other. In one sense, having Jonah end up in the fish at the conclusion of chapter 1 does make some sense. And then chapter 2 starts with him praying. I get that that's where the English Bibles often go, not all of them, but that's not really something that the manuscript supports. So go figure. If you have a better hypothesis, I would love to know. But thanks for watching.